Welcome to Bible Study with Fred. This morning, we're continuing this discussion of the events around the Judah and Tamar incident in Genesis 38. So I'm going to continue with the middle part of the story, Genesis 38, 12 to 23 from the King James Version. In the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comforted and went up into his sheep shearers to Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And it was told Tamar, saying, Behold, thy father-in-law goeth to Timnath to shear his sheep. And she put her widow's garments off from her, and covered her with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place, which is by the way to Timnath, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given unto him to wife. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot, because she had covered her face. And he turned in unto her by the way, and said, Go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee. For he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What wilt thou give me, that thou mayest come in unto me? And he said, I will send thee a kid from the flock. And she said, Wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it? And he said, What pledge shall I give? And she said, Thy signet, and thy bracelets, and thy staff that is in thine hand. And he gave it her, and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. And she arose and went away, and laid by her veil from her, and put on the garments of her widowhood. And Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he found her not. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, Where is the harlot that was openly by the wayside? And they said, there was no harlot in this place. And he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. And also the men of the place said that there was no harlot in this place. And Judah said, Let her take it to her, lest we be ashamed. Behold, I sent this kid, and thou hast not found her. Excuse me. Tamar promised Shelah is ignored. This culture is rather bizarre to us, but certain economic factors should be considered, particularly the powerlessness of women. Tamar concocted a plan to have a child, a plan which we find at best strange and very objectionable morally. She disguised herself as a prostitute and would look and would prostitute would look and went to Timnath where Judah was shearing sheep. Covering her face, an action that in some modern cultures has come to mean severe modesty, signified her then as a harlot. Notice how it was an act of modesty with Rebecca in 24:65, chapter 24, verse 65. When he negotiated with her a price for her services, she demanded of him some things that would definitely be identified as belonging to him as a deposit until he could send her a kid of his goats. After the deed was done, she went back to being Tamar, the widow of Onan and Ur. Judah could not find her, and witnesses denied there was a prostitute there, a harlot. Judah then acknowledged that he had done his part to make good on the deal and decided to leave things as they were. Lest an unbalanced, carnal, or wicked person think that this passage justifies men going to prostitutes as being acceptable to God, let us examine something important. First, it is vital to a clear understanding of reality, as explained in the Bible, that God permits man to do many things that man wants to do that are against God's preferences and standards, but that none of man's moves can prevent God's ultimate will from being accomplished. Women had no political power in this culture. A woman had to accomplish her wishes sometimes by being clever or subtle or appealing to a man's sense of ego or honor. Woman was no longer Adam's helper, worthy or meet to be his partner, as would be said later, his fellow heir in the grace of life, as in 1 Peter 3:7, or equal to him in God's eyes, as in Galatians 3:28. Woman had become a servant, a pack animal, not much better than an oven in which to create the next generation, preferably of men. Finally, there are enough admonitions about adultery that harlotry and prostitution are clearly not acceptable behavior. Although God will use a harlot in his ministry of reconciliation of man to himself, such as Rahab of Jericho, Joshua 2:1, the behavior is proscribed as adultery and fornication are forbidden. For adultery, see Exodus 20:14. Judah has had sexual relations with his daughter-in-law unknowingly, but things will become even more complicated in a short time. Judah followed the impulses of his culture in comforting himself with whom he thought was a harlot when his wife died, and Tamar did what she thought she must do to secure a child, hopefully a son, lest she be a widow for the rest of her life in Judah's household. We know in life that human beings often do things that were better done differently, and yet God uses them anyway. This is one argument against both abortion and suicide. No matter how you got here or what you are or have done, God can and will give you a special purpose in his plans. This passage is a warning to us to be careful of viewing cultural references or desperation as doctrine, or to think since it is reported, it must mean that it's approved by God, lest someone think this activity is acceptable behavior for a Christian. Just because a preacher declares it's Bible does not mean that something written is doctrine or even good. Just look at the context. As Miles Coverdale wrote in the introduction to his Bible translation in the 1500s, quote, "It will greatly help you to understand Scripture if you note not only what is spoken and written, but of whom and to whom, with what words, at what time, where, to what intent, with what circumstances, considering what goes before and what follows," unquote. Um, so I'm going to stop there. We're going to continue with this interesting story of Judah and Tamar. Judah is in the line of Christ, and we'll do that next time. Thank you for listening and watching.